feels. I'm coming to you from Basking Ridge, New Jersey, where I work at Ridge High School. And tonight our topic is 5.7, which is public policy and economic growth. So what we're going to be looking to do this evening is see if we can explain, using graphs as appropriate, public policies that are aimed at influencing long-run economic growth. And as part of that discussion, we'll want to be able to define supply-side fiscal policies. So those are the content objectives. We're also going to be focusing on skill 2A, which asks us to use economic concepts, principles, or models to explain how a specific economic outcome occurs or what action should be taken in order to achieve a specific economic outcome. So I'm guessing you're getting good enough at this to figure out that the way these things go together is like this. If the government wants the economic growth, which of the following policies should it pursue, right? We're looking at the outcome. We want long-run economic growth. Then we're given a list of policies. Which one of those policies would cause economic growth? That's a very common way that this topic is assessed on the AP macro exam. So how are you going to know if you're ready for this? Well, you'll want to be able to identify public policies that are likely to impact productivity as well as labor force participation. And then you want to be able to explain how those policies that impact productivity and labor force participation can affect real GDP per capita and economic growth. So that's our goal for this evening. So we're going to get into this by starting with the warm-up. Mr. Romano teed up an excellent question for us last night, designed to lay the groundwork for continuing into public policy and economic growth with this question. So you were asked to look at question 1, parts A through C from the 2013 free response questions. Hopefully you had a chance to do this already based on watching yesterday's lesson, but if not, we're going to go through pretty slowly so you can either do it with us as we go now, or you can pause the video if you're watching it after the fact, solve the problem, and then see if you got it right. Okay? We are told to assume that the United States economy is operating at full employment. That means current output is equal to potential output. We want to use a correctly labeled graph of the long-run aggregate supply curve, short-run aggregate supply curve, and aggregate demand curves to show each of the following: current price level and current output level. So as always, you want to ace your graphs. So you're going to start with correctly labeled axes. And you should be getting really good at putting price level and real GDP as your axes for your ADAS model. Okay, I always recommend, even regardless of the way the curves are presented in the problem, I always recommend to my students that they find current output first by using aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply. Find your current output and price level, and then use your long run aggregate supply curve to show the condition of the economy. So we know we're at full employment levels of output, which means the long run aggregate supply curve is right there where YF equals Y1. So that's what your graph should look like. Let's move on to part B. We're asked to assume that personal savings in the United States increase and to use a correctly labeled graph of the loanable funds market to show the impact of the increase in personal savings on real interest rates. So in a loanable funds model, you want to make sure you have those axes correctly labeled. We have the real interest rate on the vertical axis and the quantity of loanable funds on the horizontal axis. Give yourself a downward sloping demand for loanable funds curve and an upward sloping supply of loanable funds curve. Use that to find your initial equilibrium real interest rate and quantity of loanable funds. This is skill 4A, draw a correctly labeled graph. And then remember, skill 4C is to show the effect of a change on that graph. So an increase in savings is going to lead to an increase in the supply of loanable funds. Most of us.
Excuse me, Jen. Sorry to break in here. Could you reshare your slides? I think it's not advancing as you intend.
Oh, okay. Yes, I can. How's it look?
That looks great. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Thanks for that, Michael. Okay, so we're looking at a graph of the loanable funds model. We've increased the supply of loanable funds to show the increase in personal savings on real interest rates. And remember, show in a graph means make sure that you indicate your directional change. So here is our new equilibrium. Our new equilibrium real interest rate has decreased, is lower than the original, and we have an increase in the quantity of loanable funds. Right. The last part that we asked you to do for today was based on Part C, which asks us, based on the real interest rate change in Part B, will interest rate sensitive expenditures increase, decrease, or remain unchanged? And the answer is interest sensitive expenditures will increase because with a decrease in the real interest rate increases the profitability of investment spending projects, all else equal. And so firms are going to engage in more of them. We are seeing the topic slide only. Okay, so there's something wrong with the PowerPoint. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to see if we can get this
I
back
think
over
that was
here.
my earlier message, so I think we
Okay,
should be good now.
okay, thanks, Michael. Okay, sorry for the technical difficulties. The wonders of going live. All right,
That looks
how are
great.
we? That looks good. Okay, the slide's advancing. Okay,
Yes.
great. Okay, so we're on part C. We're looking at the real interest rate change here. In part B, we saw the real interest rate fell. We know that causes an increase in interest sensitive expenditures, which increases the economic growth rate because we know investment spending is the spending that firms do on productive capacity. Investment spending increases the rate of capital formation, which is a driver of economic growth. So this is what a full and complete answer to the question looks like. You've got your ADAS model, your loanable funds model, and your answers to parts C1 and C2. Okay, so let's get into a review of a few things that most of this is just going to be a review of last night because really Mr. Romano's lesson on economic growth really sets us up for what we want to know in tonight's lesson. So you'll remember that we show economic growth in the PPC model, and we can also show it in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. To show it in a PPC model, we indicate that we can produce more consumer goods and capital goods with our resources, and we show that by shifting the curve out and to the right. In an aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, we show economic growth by shifting the long run aggregate supply curve to the right? So this would be a new long run equilibrium in an economy that had experienced economic growth. So way back in Unit 1, you learned what the causes of economic growth were when you learned what were the factors that shifted a PPC. So there's really only two things that can result in economic growth. So the first thing is if an economy acquires more resources. If we have an increase in the amount of resources, we can produce more of both goods, both capital goods and consumer goods. We can also achieve economic growth with, as you learned last night, an increase in the productivity of existing resources. So what does an increase in the amount of resources look like? If an economy acquires more natural resources, for example, if there's an increase in the amount of labor. And so that's going to connect us to this idea of the labor force participation rate that is identified as one of the essential knowledge statements for this unit. Now, we learned about productivity last night when Mr. Romano explained the production function, and you learned that increases in technology or technological advancement, increases in the amount of physical capital per worker, and increases in human capital all increase the amount of output a given worker can produce. So increases in the productivity of existing resources is a major driver of economic growth as well. So really the goal of this lesson is to figure out what kinds of government policies influence this or this. And that's how we can connect public policy with economic growth. So just remember back in Unit 2, you learned about how we measure unemployment, and part of that included a discussion of the labor force participation rate. So you'll remember that it is defined as the labor force divided by the population age 16 and older times 100. That's a rate, right? Whenever we see a rate, we can multiply by 100. So the labor force divided by the population age 16 and older. So the labor force, you'll remember, is the sum of employed and unemployed workers. And you'll probably remember that at the natural rate of unemployment, the number of unemployed workers is equal to the sum of the frictionally unemployed and structurally unemployed workers. So our natural rate of unemployment is frictional unemployment plus structural unemployment. So all else equal, an increase in an economy's labor force participation rate will increase the number of workers in an economy, and full employment levels of output will increase, right? If you have more workers, you can produce more output. And similarly, a decrease in the labor force participation rate will decrease the number of workers in an economy and decrease the full employment level of output. So that's the connection between how many workers are working and how much output you're getting out and how much output an economy can produce. Really quickly, you want to remember that the supply of loanable funds represents the relationship between real interest rates and the quantity of loanable funds supplied. And all else equal, an increase in real interest rates is going to increase the quantity of loanable funds supplied. So savers are attracted to high rates of return on their savings, right? If you put your money in the bank and you earn 0% interest, you don't have much incentive to save. If you put your money in the bank and you earn 20% interest, you have a lot more incentive to save your money instead of spending it. So the higher the real interest rate, the higher the quantity of loanable funds supplied. Don't forget that however, not an increase in the supply of loanable funds is going to drive down interest rates. And this is probably important to remember because some of the policies we're going to look at are designed to increase the supply of loanable funds. So if we have a public policy that increases the supply of loanable funds, that'll drive down real interest rates, which will lead to increased capital formation, which will increase the economic growth rate. Okay, so now let's get into what you need to know. Basically, we're going to be looking at what are those policies that influence the productivity of existing resources and the labor force participation rate. One of the things you might want to think about, though, is why would economic growth be a policy objective in the first place? Why is economic growth a good thing? And in general, the answer to that question is the higher a nation's real GDP per capita, the higher the standard of living for people who live in that nation. That's generally true. The higher the real GDP per capita, the greater the economic prosperity of the country, and the higher the standard of living for people who live in it. Just remember a couple of things about the weaknesses of real GDP in and of itself as an economic goal. Right. So you learned some of these things back in Unit 2, and Mr. Romano reviewed a couple of them last night as well. So real GDP per capita is real GDP divided by population. So if the population increases faster than real GDP increases, then real GDP per capita can actually fall. So increases in real GDP is something that we look at as a way we measure the health of the economy. But if the population is growing at a faster rate than real GDP is increasing, then the real GDP per capita is falling. So keep that in mind. Keep in mind also that neither real GDP nor real GDP per capita tell us anything about how income or wealth is distributed in a country, and economic inequality, as you may have learned, can have implications for a society. So we don't learn anything about how equally or unequally real GDP is distributed simply by looking at it. One other thing to remember is that real GDP and real GDP per capita, they can include things that aren't necessarily signs of a healthy or prosperous economy, right? So increased spending on healthcare for chronic diseases like diabetes or heart disease, that would lead real GDP to go up. We wouldn't necessarily say though that increasing rates of those conditions would be good for an economy or good for a country. And also things that we might consider to be signs of a high quality of life or a high standard of living, like families spending more time going to the park together or engaged in leisure together, those things aren't captured by GDP. So in general, the rule is the higher nation's real GDP per capita, the higher the standard of living for people in that nation. But we do want to be mindful of what GDP does and doesn't tell us. Okay, so now remember, these are the things that cause an increase in productivity: technological advancements, increases in physical capital per worker, and increases in human capital per worker. So what can government do, if anything, to advance those things? Well, subsidies or tax credits to firms that engage in research and development can incentivize firms to engage in more of it, which can produce technological innovation. Similarly, rather than incentivizing firms to do it, the government can spend money on programs that lead to technological innovation. NASA would be an example of a government run program, a government agency whose innovations have had major benefits for the economy as a whole. We can also increase the physical capital per worker with very similar government policies. We can subsidize or provide tax credits to firms that engage in investment spending, right? And investment spending on physical capital will increase the productive capacity of an economy. So, an investment tax credit would be a way to increase the amount of physical capital per worker. Government spending on infrastructure is another thing that can increase the amount of physical capital in an economy. And when you divide physical capital by the number of workers, an increase in infrastructure would increase the amount of physical capital per worker. Infrastructure is so important that it often gets its own category. But you can think of it as something that increases productivity because any of the infrastructure that firms use to transport goods and services, to deliver goods and services, any improvements in those are going to benefit firms in a way that allow them to spend less money on a given business function and more money on something else. The example that always comes to mind to me is when I'm sitting in the car in traffic on a highway surrounded by 18 wheelers. And I think about the goods and services that are in those trucks and how long it's taking to get from point A to point B. I'm thinking about the gasoline that's being wasted as the trucks are idling. I'm thinking about the hourly wage of those workers and how much of that cost is associated with idling in traffic. So when the government spends money to improve the road system, right, it increases or it benefits traffic congestion. It improves traffic congestion. So the cost of business for firms engaged in transporting resources, transporting goods and services, are going to go down, and they can use the money they've saved on producing more goods and services. So infrastructure is a major driver of economic activity. It can't the importance of it can't be overstated. All right. And then finally, we have increases in human capital. And again, same kind of a thing. The government can subsidize firms who invest in their employees' productive capacity, or they can give tax credit to firms that provide education or job training. Hopefully, when you go into the workforce, you'll work for an employer that's got some kind of a program that allows you to advance your education. Sometimes those are funded with tax credits or subsidies, and that's one way to improve an economy's human capital. The government, again, can spend money directly on these things. The GI Bill is a great example of government spending on education, Pell Grants, Stafford loans. That's money that the federal government puts in the hands of students that allows them to advance their human capital in ways that have economy-wide benefits. So these are the major drivers of productivity, and these are the ways that governments can influence that productivity. Okay. All right, now let's think this one is a little bit more subtle. It's a little bit more nuanced, but it's a good to have an understanding that government policies can influence workers' decisions to enter the labor market and become part of the labor force. So a really important one that you're likely to hear about is called an earned income tax credit. And what I want you to think about is a couple with a newborn child. And one of the parents, the mom or the dad, one of the parents is deciding whether or not to return to the workforce and pay for childcare or stay home with that child. Depending on how much that worker earns, it may be cost effective for one of the parents to stay home and not be in the labor force because the cost of the expense of putting a child in daycare may outweigh the benefits of the income earned by returning to work. So, one government policy that's been adopted is to provide what's called an earned income tax credit. So, that basically has the effect of raising the wage for people returning to work in ways that might make at the margins their decision to re-enter the labor force one that causes them to do so. So the earned income tax credit is a way to increase the number of people who are in the labor force, which therefore then is going to increase your full employment levels of output. Another government program is Social Security. And as you know, Social Security provides income to people who are retired. And over the course of my lifetime, the age at which you can start collecting retirement benefits has increased. And so if you have to work longer and retire later, that's going to increase the size of the labor force by increasing the age at which people retire and leave the labor force. So there's another public policy that could affect labor force participation. Finally, and we don't want to get into the weeds too much. We don't want to get into too much detail, but you probably want to understand that government policies can influence the natural rate of unemployment. And a great concrete example would be increased spending on job training. So remember that structural unemployment exists when there's a mismatch between the skills workers have and the skills needed by workers in the economy. And so structurally unemployed people are out of work for as long as it takes, and they're part of the labor force. They're part of the but they're unemployed. Sometimes they leave the labor force in order to get job training. Sometimes they leave the labor force because they're discouraged. They're discouraged workers. They stop looking for work. So increased spending on job training that retools workers' skills to make them better matched to the needs of the economy can also increase the labor force participation rate. So those are just some examples of how government policies can influence people's decisions to work or to enter or exit the labor market. Right. So what we've really been talking about fall into the realm of what are called supply side policies. So an increase in productivity in the long run is going to increase the potential output that an economy produces, right? It's going to shift that long run aggregate supply curve to the right. So some of those could impact the short run aggregate supply curve first, and very often what happens is increases in productivity that shift short run aggregate supply are become permanent, and it kind of drags long run aggregate supply along with it. So for the purpose of this discussion, it's probably sufficient to just say supply side fiscal policies are designed to influence aggregate supply, right? It's designed to, in the long run, increase the productive capacity of the economy. So that's generally what's referred to by supply side economics. So there's not a lot of disagreement that increases in productivity are going to increase the productive capacity of an economy, but there's a lot of disagreement and a lot of controversy over whether the government should try to influence aggregate supply, and even where there's agreement that it should, there's disagreement over what are the best ways for the government to do that. So those kinds of discussions are pretty far outside of the scope of your basic AP, your basic principles of macroeconomics course in college, and they're outside of the scope of the AP exam. But you do want to understand that when we talk about supply side fiscal policy, we're talking about those government policies that are designed to influence aggregate supply, designed to increase productivity, designed to increase the amount of workers working in the economy. I did a careful review of the questions that are available in the question bank on AP Classroom, and of the questions that you might be likely to see related to supply side policies. And there's probably one or two other points that are worth making here for you. So, in general, supply side economists assert that policies that make it cheaper and easier to start and operate a business can increase real GDP in the long run, because any money that firms are not spending in taxes or not spending complying with federal regulations or government regulations is money that firms can be using to produce goods and services. And so, for that reason, supply side economists tend to advocate for tax cuts for businesses. And you might see them as corporate income or business income tax cuts, or a tax cut on corporate profits. Interest income tax cuts are other. Is another thing that you might see that should trigger you to think, oh, we're kind of looking at the supply side. And finally, deregulation. Again, the less money firms are spending to comply with specific regulations, the more money they have, all else equal, to produce goods and services. Now, there's a lot of controversy about supply side economics, and again, that's outside the purview of this course, but this is kind of what we're talking about, this idea that policies that make it cheaper and easier to start and run a business can increase real GDP in the long run. An example I use when I'm teaching my class is a company that makes tires, right? So the major raw material in the production of tires is rubber. And I also used to work when I was in college. I worked in a restaurant, and there were these rubber mats all over the floor in the restaurant, and they were there by law. And in part, it was to prevent slipping, and it was also in part to protect the to serve as shock absorbers. So factory floors often have some rubber matting on them in order to serve as shock absorbers to protect the spines of workers so that they don't end up suffering any kind of back condition or back injury as a result of being on their feet all day on factory floors. So imagine you're a tire company and you've got rubber going in to produce your tires, but you've also got these rubber mats on the floor in order to comply with that regulation. If that regulation is suddenly lifted and the firm no longer has to use some of its rubber to make those mats, it can now devote all of that rubber to the production of tires. So you can see how deregulation could lead to an increase in the amount of output that that company could produce. So that's why deregulation is often considered a supply side policy. Okay, so finally, supply side economists also advocate for tax cuts on income earned from savings. And this is probably the most important thing to know for AP Macro is that remember that since savings provides the supply of loanable funds, anything that increases people's willingness to save money is going to increase the supply of loanable funds, which is going to bring down real interest rates. Okay, so interest income tax cuts, when you read that, you should think, oh, how is that going to affect the behavior of savers? And then how is that going to affect the supply of loanable funds? The last point to understand is that very often, a supply side economist will advocate for a tax cut for income, an income tax cut, based on the premise that all else equal, lower tax rates incentivize more work. And so the more work workers are doing, the more productive capacity of the economy. All else equal, lower income taxes also lead to higher disposable income. So we learned when we studied the effect of an income tax as a demand side policy that when there's an increase in the amount of disposable income families have, they can choose to do two things with it, right? They can save it or they can spend it. And the amount of a tax cut they're going to save or spend are a function of the marginal propensity to save and the marginal propensity to consume. But all else equal, a tax cut, unless the marginal propensity to consume is 100%, all else equal, and a tax cut will increase the amount of savings of households, which will again increase the supply of loanable funds and drive down real interest rates. So for the purpose of this course and for the purpose of the AP Macro exam, you really, when you see uh, a tax cut, decreasing taxes, lower income taxes, you should read that. And unless something else in the question leads you to conclude that you're being asked about a supply side policy, a tax cut needs to be read as a demand side policy, right? Our typical fiscal policy tools, increase government spending, decrease taxes, those are to be understood as demand side policies designed to influence aggregate demand. However, as we've just seen, some types of government spending and some types of tax cuts can influence the supply side. So just read your question really carefully. Okay? All right, so I'm going to take you through now some questions so you can get a sense of what this looks like on the exam. All right, so here's a multiple choice question that's designed to assess skill A. We're saying an increase in which of the following is most likely to promote economic growth? And you can read your answer choices. Think about what happens when you increase consumer spending. That's an increase in aggregate demand. If you're already at full employment levels of output, an increase in aggregate demand is going to create an inflationary gap. The economy doesn't have more resources. An increase in demand is only going to result ultimately in higher prices in the long run. Well, there's those words, investment tax credits. So think about that. So an investment tax credit reduces the cost and increases the profitability of investment spending projects. So that's going to lead to more capital formation. So once we find the answer we're looking for in the answer choices, you can skim the rest of the answers, but you should know that investment tax credits are most likely to promote economic growth. So that's going to be the correct answer. Okay, so now I'm going to give you a minute to do this one on your own. Okay, did the right answer jump out at you? right? Long run economic growth is a function of capital formation. It's a function of having more productive capacity in an economy. So if we subsidize businesses to purchase more cap, that is going to increase, it's going to change their incentives. They're going to be more likely to purchase capital goods. So that's going to be the correct answer. Okay, so this one is slightly different. It's asking about if we engage in this policy, what is the most likely thing to happen? So this is like skill 3B. Okay, since we're focusing on this one, and we reviewed this right at the beginning of the lesson, hopefully this one jumps out at you. If subsidies for R&D on new technologies lead to an increase in the average productivity of labor, what will most likely happen to real GDP per capita and long-run aggregate supply for a given population? And the answer is real GDP per capita will increase and long-run aggregate supply will increase. Okay, and there's one more. This one's a little trickier, so I'm going to give you a moment. Okay, so when you see that term long run growth, think, okay, that's a function of investment spending, which is a function of the real interest rate. Okay, and we're in a recession, which means we're going to want some. So, policymakers who are concerned about fostering long run economic growth in an economy that's currently in a recession would most likely recommend, well, we're going to want to see some expansionary policy, but we're really worried about interest rates. Right, that's what this question is telling us we want to be considering. So we can look through the answer choices, and right away we can rule out anything that's contractionary. So we're not going to want to sell bonds, and we're not going to want to raise taxes. So A is out, B is out, and C is out. So then we really have to choose between D and E. So we know that buying bonds increases the money supply, which drives down interest rates. So we know that's expansionary. Now, if we're concerned about fostering long-run economic growth, we want we want we want to avoid anything that would increase in real interest rates. So remember that when we reduce spending, all else equal, when the government reduces spending, that's contractionary. So that's not going to be a good policy solution. So what we'll want to do is buy bonds and then not change fiscal policy. That would be the answer to this question. Okay, so you see how you put those pieces together? You read that term long run growth in the question, you think about combinations of monetary and fiscal policy, think about how, whether they're expansionary or contractionary, and think about how they would influence interest rates, and you have all the tools you need to answer this question. All right, so we're going to finish up in this section with an FRQ that I really like. It really puts all of these concepts together, and hopefully it'll set you up really well with your homework for tonight. Okay, so we're going to go through as we've done in the past. We're going to do each part of the question and we're going to do it together. Okay, so I wanted the whole question to be on the screen while we were doing it. So part A, so we're remember, we always want to read the question. We're told the country is at full employment and it produces two types of goods, consumer goods and capital goods. It should come as no surprise to read part A and see that we have to draw a correctly labeled graph of the production possibilities curve with consumer goods on the horizontal axis and capital goods on the vertical axis. We then have to indicate a point on the graph labeled X that represents full employment and a possible combination in which both goods are being produced. So they're telling us to read the question carefully. They're telling us exactly how they want us to label the graph. So we want capital goods on the vertical axis and consumer goods on the horizontal axis. We're not told anything about increasing or decreasing or increasing or constant opportunity cost. So a pretty typical PPC curve is bowed out from the origin to show increasing opportunity costs. And now we have to label graph point X to represent full employment. So remember, anywhere along the curve represents a full employment output uh, but with different combinations of consumer goods or capital goods. So we could be at a point here producing more capital goods than consumer goods. We could be at a point here producing more consumer goods than capital goods. But any point along this curve is analogous to full employment levels of output. So let's just put our point X right there. Okay, and then we're told, assume there's an increase in the country's national savings. Draw a correctly labeled graph of the loanable funds market to show a change in the real interest rate from the increase in savings. Okay, so we've already done this. We have a real interest rate, quantity of loanable funds. We have an upward sloping supply of loanable funds curve, a downward sloping demand for loanable funds curve. We have our equilibrium real interest rate and quantity of loanable funds. So there's our graph. That's our correctly labeled graph. And now we have to show the increase in country's national savings. So remember, savings is the supply of loanable funds. This is money in the bank available to be lent out. So an increase in the supply of loanable funds is going to produce a decrease in the real interest rate and an increase in the quantity of loanable funds. So there's our answer to part B. We have a correctly labeled graph of the loanable funds market showing that the increase in savings drives down real interest rates. Now, part C says on the same graph from part A, so here's our graph from part A, show another point labeled Z that represents full employment and a new combination of consumer goods and capital goods consistent with the increase in the country's national savings. All right. Are you able to put these dots together? When we have an increase in the supply of loanable funds and a decrease in the real interest rate, all else equal, we're going to be engaged in more investment spending on capital goods. So in the short run, we're going to be producing a new combination of capital goods and consumer goods that indicates we're producing more capital goods. Okay, so you see how that works? An increase in the supply drives down the interest rate. We're going to produce more capital goods now. And what ultimately is going to happen? Will the long run aggregate supply curve shift to the right, shift to the left, or remain the same? And the answer, of course, is that if we produce more capital goods today, then what does our long run aggregate supply curve look like? It's going to shift to the right. Okay, long run aggregate supply will shift to the right because increased spending on capital goods leads to an increase in the rate of capital formation, which increases the economic growth rate. And we show that by shifting the long run aggregate supply curve to the right. All right, so that's how we would go about answering this question. So you might have noticed, wait, there's no public policy in this question. This isn't a 5.7 question at all. And you're right, it's not. But remember, government policy can influence national savings. So think about what could this question have asked you that would have been a 5.7 question that would have asked how can government excuse me, how could government increase or affect an increase in national savings? And that question is going to show up in your homework for tonight. All right, so this is what we've taken a look at. So our enduring understanding here is that authorities and organizations institute policies that affect economic growth. And we focused on skill 2. If we want economic growth to occur, what policy actions can be undertaken to influence that? So we've looked at graphs, and we've used graphs to show economic growth, and then we've explained public policies that are aimed at influencing long run economic growth. We've also taken a look at some supply side fiscal policies that are designed to, some of those affect aggregate demand by increasing the amount of investment spending, which increases the long run economic growth rate. Some of them will act on aggregate supply. We talked about increases in productivity, increases in the number of workers who are working, and also potential output by influencing the incentives that affect households and businesses' economic behavior. So those were the goals for this evening. And hopefully now you can identify what those policies are that are likely to impact productivity and labor force participation, and then explain how those policies that do so will affect real GDP per capita and economic growth. This is the last topic in Unit 5. Tomorrow, Mr. Romano is going to be with you, and he'll be talking about the first topic in Unit 6. We're going to take Friday and next week to go over Unit 6, which is a really important and fascinating unit in economics. We're going to open up the economy and look at international trade. And remember, the goal is to have students learn all of the topics in the course. And then once we've done that, we'll transition and spend the next few weeks on reviewing Units 1 through 5. So this is your homework for tonight. So you can pause, you can take a picture of it if you want to work on it now. If you're watching this after the fact, you can pause the video and take a crack at it. And this is where Mr. Romano will pick up tomorrow. Okay, so device and internet access. Please remember that we know the College Board is aware that not all students have access to the internet or a device. If you or someone you know has any device needs or connectivity issues, please don't hesitate to reach out to the College Board at cb.org/tech. Okay. Thank you again so much for being with us tonight. Sorry about the technical difficulties at the beginning. Have a good night.